My name is Lindsay Holt. I'm 27 years old, and what happened to me last summer in the Chattahoochee National Forest changed my life forever. I used to think I knew what being scared meant, like that sudden jolt when a friend jumps out at you in a dark hallway, or that tense moment when you're perched at the top of a roller coaster. But real fear is a cold burn, a clawing terror that sits in your gut and refuses to leave, even after the danger is gone. That's what we found at Black Rock Ravine, a secluded corner of the forest that took us 3 hours down rutted dirt roads, around hairpin mountain passes, and miles away from any sense of safety. If you ask me now why we chose that place to camp, I can't give you a rational explanation other than I wanted an off-the-grid experience. I organized the trip with 3 friends. Derek, who's 29, my closest friend but also our group's designated pessimist. He thinks of every worst-case scenario and tries to plan for it. Macy, 30, an artist with wide, curious eyes and an unshakable belief in the good in people, and apparently in strange forests. Troy, 28, quiet and brooding, with a permanent air of mystery that I used to find charming. He grew up in a rural area and often mentioned his grandparents' campfire tales about evil spirits or devils lurking in the woods. It was supposed to be a 4-day trip in my modest RV, a 24-footer that's seen better days. We planned on a couple nights by the ravine, some scenic hikes to a hidden waterfall we'd read about online, and plenty of roasted marshmallows under the stars. That was the dream, anyway. What follows is the reality. Day 1. Arrival at Black Rock Ravine. We set off early in the morning from Atlanta to beat traffic. Derek rode shotgun, scanning the GPS while Macy and Troy dozed in the back. As for me, I was high on coffee and excitement. The drive up into the mountains was gorgeous. Dense green trees, winding roads, occasional glimpses of valleys stretching below. It was nearly dusk by the time we turned onto a barely visible side road that our maps disagreed on. My paper trail map showed a route leading to Black Rock Ravine, whereas Derek's phone GPS insisted there was nothing out there but unmarked forest. I trusted the old map more, if only because it had that musty, authentic look like some treasured family heirloom. The deeper we went, the rougher the trail got. Rocks and potholes battered the RV's suspension. Finally, we pulled into a clearing near a cluster of tall pines. The alleged ravine lay another quarter-mile away, but the ground was too uneven for the RV to go any farther. We'd simply park there and trek in for day hikes. The moment we parked, we noticed how quiet it was. At first, I chalked it up to the hush of evening, but it was more than that. No bird calls, no chirping insects, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. A dead, unsettling stillness settled over everything. I hopped out, set my hands on my hips, and breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth. Derek joined me, eyes scanning the tree line. "This place is remote," he said, hesitant. "Exactly," I replied, feigning confidence. "That's the whole point." Macy piled out after us, carrying an armful of paint supplies. She caught the last rays of the sun gleaming through the trees. "Wow," she breathed. "It's like the perfect painting waiting to happen." Troy stepped down, gaze flicking from tree trunk to tree trunk. "My grandparents used to talk about spots like this," he said softly, almost as if to himself. He didn't elaborate, and I shrugged it off. We popped out our folding chairs, set up a makeshift fire pit, and started to settle for the night. The sky was a tapestry of deep purple and black, studded with unfamiliar stars. Even though I was used to city lights blocking the night sky, it still felt eerily dark. The silence pressed in, but I told myself it was just that hush that falls when the sun goes down. Once we built a small fire, the circle of light made things feel more welcoming. We ate tinfoil dinners and s'mores in companionable chatter. When I looked up an hour later, the forest around us was completely black. I realized with a start that not a single insect flew near our lantern, not a single moth or mosquito. We retreated into the RV around midnight, and I locked the doors out of habit. My rig had a small bed in the back for me, a fold-down bunk for Macy, and a table that converted into a sleeping area for Derek and Troy to share. It wasn't spacious, but it worked. I was dozing off when I heard it, a faint sound like tapping on metal near the back tire. I blinked, uncertain if I was dreaming. Then came a slow, deliberate scrape, as though claws, no, not claws, I reassured myself, just branches, brushed against the RV's exterior. I rolled over, holding my breath. When the sound didn't repeat, I eventually managed to fall into a fitful sleep. In the morning, I woke early, half expecting to find raccoon tracks or scratch marks. I saw nothing. The forest outside remained deathly silent. We had a quick breakfast and decided to do a short hike to orient ourselves. Macy carried her sketchbook and a camera. She wanted references for her paintings. Derek lugged a small pack with water, first aid, and snacks, as usual. Troy walked a few paces behind us, quiet and observant. The trail led us toward the ravine, a steep drop where the landscape fell away into a jagged valley. The trees grew denser as we approached, and I noticed an odd shape hanging from one of the branches. It was a stick figure, maybe 6 inches tall, tied together with dried grass. It swayed gently in the breeze. I reached out to touch it. Derek grasped my wrist. "Don't," he said. I pulled my hand free and shot him an annoyed look, but a nagging sense of dread made me follow his advice. While I stood there, Macy snapped a photo. "This is so weird. It looks old, like it's been here for a while," she murmured. Troy muttered something about how his grandparents had told him of certain handmade figures left as warnings. I tried to probe for more details, but he just tightened his jaw and kept walking. We continued along a narrow path that hugged the edge of the ravine. About 20 minutes in, Macy gasped. "Look." She pointed to a pine tree with swirling symbols carved into its bark. They looked like bizarre runes or letters that looped in on themselves. The cut lines were dark with age, the wood grown over in places. "More weirdness," Derek said under his breath. He snapped a photo with his phone, but it was acting glitchy. "Why does my battery say 12%? I charged this before we left." I checked my own phone. Mine was at 50%, though it should have been near full. A prickle of unease formed at the base of my skull. This place wasn't just remote. It felt wrong. Over the next ridge, we found the remnants of what might have been a campsite, a fire ring of blackened stones and some scattered beer cans. But it looked abandoned for years. We paused there to rest. Troy cleared his throat. "I think we should head back soon," he said quietly. "It's only noon," I countered. He shook his head. "Just a feeling." As if on cue, the sky rumbled. Clouds slid across the sun, turning the forest dim and gray. "Fine," I said, sensing everyone's unease. "Let's go back to the RV and regroup." By the time we returned to our site, a light drizzle had started. Rain pattered on the roof. Inside the RV, we noticed an odd smell, something metallic and burnt. Derek cursed under his breath as he fiddled with the overhead lights. "The battery's not holding a charge," he explained. "It was at half this morning, and now it's almost empty." I checked the generator, which sputtered and coughed, but never fully kicked on. "I swear I had this service 2 months ago," I muttered. Without electricity, we risked losing refrigeration for our food, not to mention heat if temperatures dropped too low. But it was still day 2. We had time to figure it out. I told myself not to panic. To lift spirits, we made sandwiches for lunch, using as little battery-powered light as possible. Derek wanted to leave right then, to drive out before the RV gave out for good. But I convinced him to stay, just one more night. Macy and Troy sided with me, albeit with some uncertainty. The rain died off in the early evening, leaving the forest soaked. We gathered around a modest fire again. This time, the atmosphere was stifling. None of us talked much. Even Macy, usually upbeat, seemed lost in thought. Troy's eyes darted from shadow to shadow. Around 10, we decided to turn in. I was exhausted from the hike and the mental strain of our failing equipment. Lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening for that tapping I'd heard the night before. At around midnight, I heard a distant moan, a sound so faint I couldn't tell if it was wind through the trees or something else. Then came soft, intermittent scratching on the RV's side. I didn't dare move. My heart thumped like a drum. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang jerked me upright. My entire body seized with adrenaline. Derek and Troy both shot out of their makeshift beds, shouting. Macy clutched her blanket, eyes wide with terror. Something was outside, pressing against the door, making it groan in its frame. In the dim lamplight, I saw the door bow slightly inward. The handle rattled. Troy rushed to brace it with his shoulder. "Whatever it is, it's strong," he yelled. Derek dove for his pocket knife, fumbling it open. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it toward the door's tiny window, and in that round pane of glass, I saw it. A pale, gaunt face, like an elongated human skull covered in sallow skin. The eyes reflected our light, shining like a cat's. There was a blackness in them that made me recoil. The thing stared in, unblinking. For a moment, we all froze. A collective gasp stuck in our throats. The face vanished, and the pressure on the door eased. Then we heard footsteps. No, more like a scraping shuffle, moving around the RV. It circled us once, twice. Each time it passed a window, I caught fleeting glimpses of that tall, emaciated figure. The limbs seemed too long, the motions jerky and unnatural. No one spoke. We waited, hearts thudding, for it to come back. But after a few minutes, the sounds faded. The forest grew silent again, as though swallowing the creature whole. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We sat up, huddled together, weapons drawn, though a single pocket knife or a hammer from the toolbox wouldn't do much against that thing. The hours crawled. At first light, we emerged with caution. The ground was muddy but showed no footprints, just shallow, amorphous impressions near the door. The aluminum siding of the RV bore long, thin scratches, like marks from spidery fingers. Macy let out a soft whimper at the sight of those scratches. "What the hell was that last night?" she whispered, hugging herself. Derek inhaled sharply. "I don't know, but I think we can all agree we should go. Now." Troy was pacing. "We should have left yesterday," he said, frustration lacing his voice. "I tried to warn you guys, but no one listened." I shot him an incredulous look. "Warn us about what? You never said anything concrete, just that your grandparents told you stories." He turned to me, eyes blazing with fear and anger. "They spoke of a devil in places like this. A spirit, maybe once human, but corrupted. It hunts at night, thrives on fear. I didn't want to believe them, but now—" He trailed off, running a shaky hand through his hair. "All the more reason to go," Derek said. I nodded, fully ready to leave. But when we tried to start the RV, it wouldn't turn over. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The battery gauge read empty, and the generator wouldn't fire up. We popped the hood, only to find strange, claw-like tears in the cables. Something had physically damaged them. Derek swore loudly, slamming the hood. "We're stuck," he said. "We might have to hike out of here." I checked the map. The nearest ranger station was at least 10 miles away, over unpredictable terrain. With the forecast threatening more rain, it would be a perilous walk. Still, it might be our only hope. We spent the day trying to figure out a plan. Should we all go together? Or split up, with 2 staying behind and 2 trekking out for help? Arguments broke out. Derek insisted all 4 of us should go. I worried we'd be too slow if we traveled as a group, especially with limited supplies. Troy thought maybe we could fix the cables, but we lacked the proper parts. Macy was so rattled by last night's encounter that she would cling to whichever plan guaranteed the most protection. Meanwhile, I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. I couldn't even get a single bar, no matter how far I hiked uphill. The daytime hush of the forest continued, broken only by our anxious voices. It felt like the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting. When the sun dipped low again, a gray gloom crept in. The tension mounted. None of us wanted a repeat of last night, but we had no illusions that locking ourselves in would be any safer. If that thing really wanted in, it would find a way. We decided to hold out until dawn, then make a final push on foot. We'd load up with water, some snacks, flashlights, and a compass. We only prayed we'd find a workable path. Night fell, cold and starless. We lit our last propane lantern inside the RV and turned off every other power source to conserve what little battery we had for flashlights. The four of us formed a circle, each armed with some makeshift weapon. Derek had his pocket knife and a heavy wrench. Macy held a kitchen knife. Troy had a hatchet from the emergency kit, and I clutched a hammer with white knuckles. Midnight came and went quietly. Midnight. I was beginning to hope that maybe the creature wouldn't return. A foolish notion, I know. Just before 1 a.m, we heard it. A rasping whisper. At first I thought it was wind. Then I realized it was calling my name. "Lindsay!" it hissed, voice stretched out in an unnerving mockery. I clenched my jaw, tears prickling at my eyes. Macy squeezed my hand. "Ignore it," she whispered. Then it called Derek's name in the exact tone I'd used an hour earlier when we'd bickered. My blood ran cold. The windows flickered with shadows. Our lantern began to flicker too, as though some unseen force tried to snuff it out. We heard tapping on the roof this time, slow and deliberate. Then something heavy scraped along the top, making an awful screech. Troy angled his head, face pale. "It's on the roof," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. A series of thumps and scrapes sounded as if it were testing our defenses. The roof vent rattled violently. We stared at it, hearts pounding, anticipating the moment it might cave in. Suddenly the thing leapt down. There was a heavy thud on the ground. The door handle jiggled again. Then it went silent. We didn't relax. We knew it was still out there, watching. Sure enough, after a few minutes, we heard the handle twist once more. This time it was followed by a soft, mocking laugh. That tore it. Derek jumped up, yanked the door open, and lunged outside with his wrench raised. "Derek, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. He stood on the wet grass, scanning the darkness with the wrench in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The beam of light revealed only silhouettes of tall pines. The haunting hush had returned. "Get back inside," Troy urged, stepping to the threshold. "We have to stay together." Derek took a step forward, and for a split second, I thought we might lose him to the darkness. But a low growl emanated from behind one of the trees, and he backed off. We heard it scuttle away, deeper into the forest. He returned, slamming the door. His eyes were wild, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's toying with us," he spat, voice trembling. For the rest of that night, we stayed huddled and alert, dozing fitfully in shifts. The creature didn't break in, but it made its presence known in every scratch, every thump, every whisper of our names from just beyond the windows. That was the longest night of my life. At dawn, we assembled what we could carry. The plan was to hike to the main road, or at least to some vantage point with cell service. Each of us wore a small backpack with water, protein bars, and emergency blankets. We also brought the map and compass. Stepping outside, we caught sight of footprints circling the RV, large, elongated impressions that certainly weren't from a normal person. Some prints ended abruptly, as though the creature had stepped into the air. My stomach lurched at the sight, but I forced my feet to move. The morning air was gray and heavy, and the forest smelled of rotting leaves. We locked up the RV, not that we thought it would protect it from further damage, but because the act of locking it felt like a hopeful gesture. "We'll be back for you." We struck out on the trail heading west, which, according to the map, should lead us toward the nearest ranger station within 10 miles. The plan was simple: walk fast, keep quiet, and stay together. Within the first hour, we realized something was wrong. The trail kept disappearing or diverging in ways that didn't match the map. Derek tried the GPS on his phone, but it showed us spinning in place, with no recognized trails. Troy swore under his breath, cursing the devil of Black Rock Ravine that seemed determined to keep us trapped. We came across more of those stick-figured totems hanging in the branches, sometimes in clusters, sometimes singly. Once, we found a half-burned candle in a hollow stump, as though left behind after some dark ritual. The deeper we went, the more the trees pressed in. The undergrowth grew thicker, forcing us to detour. Hours passed, and the sky threatened a storm. None of us spoke much. Macy's eyes were wide, flicking at every movement in the corner of her vision. Derek was breathing heavily, his face slick with sweat. Troy marched grimly at the rear, hatchet in hand. Then we saw it, a single black pine standing in a clearing, its trunk carved with more of those swirling glyphs. The symbols were fresh, as if newly cut. Blood-red sap oozed from them, dripping onto the ground. Next to the tree lay a shredded piece of clothing that looked suspiciously like a torn jacket. Troy crouched to examine it. "This is recent," he muttered. Macy stifled a cry. There might have been other campers. Did they get attacked? No one answered her. A sudden noise startled us, a distant cry, maybe human, maybe not. It echoed through the woods. I immediately thought of the creature and what it could do. "Keep moving," Derek urged. We pressed on, compass in hand, but it started spinning wildly. Derek tapped on its face, cursing. "This can't be right," he muttered. "Magnetic interference or something." Roughly an hour later, we stumbled onto a murky stream that wasn't on our map. It forced us to double back and find a shallower crossing. Each delay chipped away at our resolve. Tensions flared as we argued about which direction to take, with Derek and Troy at each other's throats. Macy tried to break it up, tears in her eyes. "Enough," I finally snapped. "We can't fight each other. That's exactly what it wants. We need to stick together, or we'll never make it out of here." My words hung in the air, and the men fell silent. We continued. We walked until the sun dipped below the horizon. We'd only covered a fraction of the distance we needed, maybe 4 or 5 miles. Our feet were blistered, our clothes soaked with sweat. We found a small clearing and set up a basic camp, no tents, just a circle of logs and a fire pit we hastily arranged. We had to rest. "Should we even risk a fire?" Macy whispered. "We need light," Troy said firmly. "It's the only way to see it coming." So we built a small fire, using the flint kit Derek had brought. The flames provided a bit of comfort, though the dancing shadows on the trees were enough to set my nerves on edge. We ate meager rations and decided on a watch schedule. Troy volunteered first. The rest of us tried to sleep, though I doubt any of us truly did. It wasn't long before we heard the creature again, rustling in the bushes, a faint rasping that might have been a laugh. Macy whimpered as she lay next to me, clutching her arms to her chest. When Troy's shift ended, Derek took over. The hours dragged. Around 3 in the morning, I was startled awake by the smell of sulfur. My eyes flew open. Derek was standing near the fire, shining his flashlight into the trees. His face was drained of color. I scrambled up, brandishing my hammer. "What is it?" He shook his head, speechless. Then we heard a branch snap behind us. We whirled around, shining the flashlights wildly. At the edge of the clearing stood the tall, twisted figure. It jerked forward a step, and we all scrambled back, forming a defensive semicircle around the weak flames. This time the creature let out a low growl, like a cross between a human moan and a wolf snarl. My blood ran cold. I raised my hammer, but my hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. Suddenly, Troy rushed forward, swinging the hatchet. "Get away from us!" he roared. The thing lurched aside with inhuman speed, and Troy's blade sliced only air. For a heartbeat, the creature was face to face with him, and we saw that its skin looked necrotic, patches of exposed bone, its mouth twisted in a grin revealing rows of pointed teeth. Then it melted back into the darkness, silent and swift. Troy stumbled to his knees, panting. "It's real," he croaked. as if we needed any more confirmation. The rest of that night passed in a terrified blur, but somehow we made it to dawn. That morning, we decided we'd keep moving, no matter how tired we were, no matter what it took. We resumed our trek, each of us half dead from lack of sleep. By mid-afternoon, we caught a glimmer of hope, a faint road in the distance, cutting through a valley. A wave of relief rushed through me. If we could get down there, maybe we'd find a ranger station, a passing car, anything. Every snapping branch behind us made us flinch. The creature was still out there, but we found an old Forest Service road, barely more than a dirt path. We followed it, hearts pounding. Just when we thought we might be out of the worst of it, we rounded a bend and saw a battered sign, Black Rock Ravine, 1 mile with a directional arrow. My stomach twisted. We'd somehow looped around near the ravine's official entrance. The sign looked old, rusted in spots, but it gave me a surge of adrenaline. If we were near a designated trailhead, a main road might be close. Macy was lagging behind, breathing heavily. "I can't go much further," she wheezed. I took her backpack to lighten her load. "We're almost out," I promised, praying that was true. We pressed on, heading away from the ravine. The forest gradually thinned. For the first time in days, I heard the faint chirping of a single bird. It was such a strange, normal sound that it almost brought tears to my eyes. Then, from behind, a long, bone-chilling shriek ripped through the air, the creature's final assault. It sprinted toward us on all fours, emerging from the underbrush. Derek shouted and flailed his wrench. Troy stood firm, raising his hatchet, while Macy and I cowered behind them. The thing lunged at Derek. He swung the wrench with all his might, catching it in the shoulder. It let out a ghastly hiss but didn't stop. Its gangly arm raked across Derek's side. He cried out in pain and stumbled, a smear of blood staining his shirt. I couldn't just stand there. With a surge of terror-fueled courage, I darted forward and brought my hammer down on the creature's back. It screeched, twisting to glare at me with those demonic eyes. For one horrifying instant, I thought it would tear me apart, but Troy lunged, hacking his hatchet down into its side. The monster reeled, letting out a guttural wail. It toppled to the ground, writhing in agony. Up close, the stench of decay radiated off it. My stomach churned. "It's not dead," Troy gasped. "Run!" Without hesitation, we grabbed Derek, who was bleeding but able to limp, and fled. I heard the thing scrambling behind us, screeching in fury. We didn't look back. Adrenaline pushed us down that winding forest road. After what felt like an eternity, we saw a battered old pickup truck parked off to the side of the road. An elderly man in a ranger's uniform stepped out, eyes wide as we stumbled toward him. "What in God's name?" he muttered. We collapsed at his feet, babbling about a creature, a devil, or something monstrous in the woods. The ranger, whose name tag read Cole, quickly radioed for backup when he saw Derek's wounds. He helped bandage him up, then guided us into the truck. When a second ranger arrived, they drove us to a small station some miles away. I half expected the creature to burst out of the tree line at any moment, but it never did. Whether we managed to wound it enough to keep it away, or if it simply decided we weren't worth the chase anymore, I couldn't say. At the station, they cleaned Derek's injuries and recommended we get him to a hospital in Clayton for stitches. As for our story, the rangers looked skeptical. They said they'd send a team to investigate the area near the ravine. But I could tell by the pitying look in their eyes they didn't really believe we'd fought some supernatural being. They chalked it up to a wild animal attack, or the stress of being lost in the woods. We never returned to retrieve the RV. When we asked the rangers to help tow it out, we were told that the area was inaccessible due to road washouts from recent rains. Funny how that road to the ravine was so easy to find on the map, yet so impossible to navigate once you were there. Eventually, I gave up on it. The insurance company called it a total loss. Derek recovered from his injuries, but carries a jagged scar across his ribcage. Macy tried to paint the creature as part of her therapy, but she burned the canvas halfway through. She told me she couldn't stand to see its eyes staring at her. Troy drifted away from us soon after, retreating into himself, perhaps blaming himself for not warning us more explicitly. As for me, I still wake up at night with the memory of that face peering through the RV window, the pale, wasted features and those reflective, predatory eyes. I wonder if it's still out there, wandering among those silent pines, waiting for the next unsuspecting group of campers. They call it the Devil of Black Rock Ravine. Maybe it was once human, corrupted by some ancient curse. Or maybe it's always been there, an embodiment of the land's darkest secrets. All I know is that it thrives on fear, isolation, and the twisted hush of those haunted woods. So here's my warning. If you ever find yourself drawn to an unmarked trail in the Chattahoochee National Forest, if you see carved symbols in the bark of trees or strange effigies made of sticks, turn around. Don't be like us. Don't go in. Because not all devils live in the fiery underworld. Some prowl the silent forests, lurking just beyond the flicker of your campfire. And once they've seen you, they might never let you go. My name is Elijah Powell. I'm 35 years old, and this is the story of what happened to me when I traveled alone into the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. People call me a wildlife photographer, but that's just a fancy way of saying I roam around the country in a refurbished RV trying to capture the perfect shot of places most folks never dare to tread. I started this lifestyle 2 years ago, chasing remote vistas in hopes that my pictures and blog posts might inspire a respect for nature, or at least pay the bills. I arrived in the Okefenokee region on a humid afternoon in late spring. The sky was a clean electric blue, but the horizon shimmered as if threatening storms by nightfall. Spanish moss swayed from gnarled cypress branches, and the pungent smell of marsh rose in waves as I drove into the Suwannee Canal recreation area. A battered wooden sign marked the campground entrance. Just a few spots for RVs, ringed by scraggly palmettos, with a narrow gravel road leading deeper into the swamp. I turned into the half-empty site, found my assigned pad, and parked. My RV is a 1990s model that I've labored over, bit by bit, to make self-sufficient. I rely mostly on solar panels for power, though I have a small backup generator. As I stepped out, a wave of sticky heat clung to my skin. The place was quieter than I expected. I heard a single bullfrog somewhere off in the distance, but no chatter of tourists, no families out roasting hot dogs. Maybe that was for the best. I could concentrate on shooting the perfect sunrise photos over the water. But soon after I parked, trouble began. My solar charge controller started throwing error codes. At first I thought it was a simple glitch. I fiddled with the wiring, jiggled a few leads, and the system steadied. Still, it set me on edge. Those panels had worked flawlessly in the last 3 states. I shrugged it off. Technical hiccups happen on the road. With the RV mostly settled, I decided to do a quick meet and greet with the local ranger to learn the lay of the land. The small ranger station perched near the entrance, a squat building flanked by tall pines. Inside, a middle-aged woman in a green uniform sat behind a desk. Her name tag read, Stokes, and her wiry hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail. "Afternoon," she said, smiling politely. "Name's Naomi Stokes. You must be the new camper in Site 4. "That's me." "Elijah Powell," I said, offering a handshake. "Just arrived, hoping to get some shots of the swamp wildlife. Maybe venture deeper in for unique angles." She nodded, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Well, it's a beautiful place, but it can be tricky. We've had reports of unusual activity around some of the backwater trails lately. Mysterious lights, odd sightings." Her eyes lingered on me, assessing. "I always tell folks, never wander off alone after dark." She was about to hand me a small pamphlet when the door opened behind me, letting in a swirl of hot air and the tang of swamp water. A tall, lanky man in muddy boots stepped in. His white beard and baseball cap gave him the look of a seasoned fisherman. He glanced at me, then turned to Naomi. "Ray, meet Elijah," Naomi said. "He's a photographer. Ray Brooks here's a local fisherman. Stays round these parts now and then." "Pleasure," I said, nodding. He tipped his cap in greeting. Naomi handed me the pamphlet. "It has map details," she said. "The trails around Stephen C. Foster State Park, plus the Suwannee Canal, if you paddle or walk. You looking for gators?" "Among other things," I replied. "I'm big on bird photography, too. The more remote the spot, the better." Ray snorted. "Plenty remote areas here, but watch yourself out there. I've seen some strange things on the water at night." He glanced at Naomi, then back at me. "Folks around here talk about a ghost child who wanders. Some say you can hear a laugh, or see footprints by the cypress knees where no footprints should be." Naomi shot him a disapproving look, but I could tell it was more caution than disbelief. "Don't go scaring him off," she said. "To me," she explained, "it's an old legend from way back. People claim a child drowned or got lost in the swamp decades ago. Occasionally, new rumors pop up. I found myself weirdly intrigued. Over my travels, I'd stumbled across all manner of local folklore: ghost trains, haunted canyons, old mining towns with rumored poltergeists. Some were clearly tall tales, others left me uneasy. I never put too much stock in them, but they always colored the experience, gave an extra layer of mythic feel." I thanked them for the info and headed back to my campsite, pamphlet in hand, thoughts buzzing. A ghost child, footprints that vanish in the water. I half smiled. If nothing else, it would make for a good story for my blog. That evening, I hopped out for a quick photography warm-up near my site. The sun had begun sinking behind the mossy treetops, painting the horizon pink and orange. The water along the edge of the recreation area was calm, mirrors of golden light flickering between the cypress trunks. I crouched low, camera in hand, adjusting settings to capture the last sliver of sun. When I rose, I noticed a small shape in the mud just a few feet away. Curious, I stepped over. Tiny footprints. The shape of a left foot, then a right, pressed shallowly into the mucky bank. They looked child-sized. Could be from a real living kid that had come through earlier in the day, except they appeared fresh, with no accompanying adult footprints. Odd. I aimed my camera and snapped a picture. I told myself some family might have passed by moments ago, though the place seemed empty enough. Still, the hair prickled at the back of my neck. Maybe it was just the evening chill. Night fell quickly, and I returned to the RV. My solar battery display read lower than expected, another small annoyance. I flipped on a single overhead light, brewed a quick coffee on my gas stove, and settled into my chair to review the day's photos. The images looked crisp, egrets gliding across still water, the cypress reflections. But some frames had a faint glitch, a fuzzy distortion in the corner. Possibly an issue with my camera sensor, yet it seemed too localized, as though something were lurking at the edge of each shot. I tried to ignore it, but the glitch nagged at me. Without cell service or reliable Wi-Fi to consult an online forum, I decided I'd run some test shots tomorrow. A wave of fatigue rolled over me. I pulled my window curtains, locked the door, and climbed into the RV's small bed. Night in the Okefenokee enveloped me with a chorus of frogs, insects, and distant splashes, probably alligators. I let the sound cradle me to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to an odd hush. The frogs had stopped, as if cut off by a flick of a switch. My ears strained for a single chirp, but none came. I shifted in the darkness, heart thumping. Then I heard it. A faint laugh, high-pitched, echoing from outside. It could have been a bird call or a raccoon squeal, but it sure sounded like a child's chuckle. I sat up, blinking away the remnants of sleep. The laugh came again, drifting through the cypress. It seemed to circle the RV once, then fade. I scrambled for my flashlight, flicking the switch, ready to peer out the window. But fear tightened my chest. Did I really want to see a child's face staring back at me? After a long moment, I steadied my breath and lifted the curtain. Darkness. Nothing but the faint silhouette of trees in the moonlight. I shut my eyes, telling myself it was a dream, some half-awake confusion. But my pulse took a while to settle, and the swamp sounds, frogs, crickets, remained eerily absent. Eventually, I sank back onto the bed, adrenaline slowly draining. It took another hour or more for sleep to reclaim me. The next morning, I woke at dawn and found my solar battery had drained again, dropping well below what last night's usage should have caused. Irritated, I spent half an hour rewiring connections and then gave up, deciding to meet the day with the limited camera battery I had. The rising sun glimmered through a low fog that clung to the water. This was prime photograph territory, and I refused to miss it due to technical frustrations. I ventured along a boardwalk that snaked deeper into the swamp, aiming to catch pictures of alligators in the morning light. The path was damp and slick, but the scenery was mesmerizing. Mist floated around the cypress knees, and Spanish moss dripped overhead in pale curtains. Everything felt suspended in a dreamlike hush. Halfway down the boardwalk, I set up my tripod, fiddling with shutter speed. That's when Naomi Stokes approached from the opposite direction, her ranger hat tilted to shield her eyes from the glare. "Morning," she said softly. "How's the photography?" "Quiet, but beautiful," I answered, glancing at the empty horizon. "No gators yet." She nodded, leaning on the railing, scanning the waters. "How was your first night?" I considered telling her about the laugh, but I hesitated, worried she'd dismiss me as jumpy or call it a coyote. "Uneventful," I lied, forcing a small smile. She pursed her lips. "If you get the chance, talk to Ray. He claims he's planning an overnight fishing trip deeper in the swamp. He might show you some good spots for photos, or at least let you tag along." I wasn't sure if that was a suggestion or a warning, yet part of me was tempted. If I could get out on the water at night with a local guide, I might capture spectacular shots. But the memory of that laugh lingered at the edges of my mind. "Thanks," I replied. "I'll keep that in mind." Naomi gave a measured nod and headed back toward the ranger station. I spent another hour capturing sunrise images, trying to shake off the restless feeling from the night. By the time I returned to camp, I'd begun to question if I'd actually heard that laugh at all. Later that day, I bumped into Ray near the boat launch. He was tinkering with a small outboard motor attached to a battered aluminum boat. I asked him if he might show me around sometime. He shrugged in a friendly way. "I'm heading out tomorrow evening," he said. "Got word the catfish are biting. If you're up for it, meet me here at 6. It was exactly the sort of invitation I'd usually jump at. A local fisherman's knowledge of hidden corners of the swamp, plus a chance to photograph wildlife at dusk. Yet I hesitated, recalling the child-sized footprints in the midnight laughter. Then again, fear had never been a strong enough deterrent to keep me from a good shot. So I thanked him and agreed to come along, ignoring the undercurrent of unease swirling inside me. That night, I grilled a simple dinner by my RV, the thick, humid air pressing on my every movement. After cleaning up, I did a quick check of my photography gear. My main camera battery read strangely low again, an inexplicable drain. Grumbling, I swapped it for a spare I'd been charging off the erratic solar system. The thought occurred to me that maybe something about the swamp's environment was messing with my electronics, but I'd never experienced anything quite like this before. I decided to call it an early night, hoping for decent sleep before tomorrow's trip with Ray. As darkness cloaked the campground, I set my phone alarm for 5:30 a.m. I had plans for a sunrise shot, then lay in bed, reading by a dim LED lamp. Outside, the swamp's nighttime chorus buzzed faintly. At least the frogs and insects were back, which gave me some relief. The silence of the previous night had been unnerving. Sometime in the early hours, I woke again to that hush. My heart thudded in my chest. A faint tapping on the RV door made my skin crawl. I forced myself to sit up, switching on the overhead lamp. The tapping persisted. Tap, 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 as if small knuckles were knocking, waiting. My mouth went dry. The door was locked, bolted too. I considered shouting, "Who is it?" But terror froze my tongue. For what felt like an eternity, I did nothing, listening as the tapping gradually moved along the outer wall of my RV. Finally, I managed to stand, crossing slowly to the window near the kitchenette. I inched the curtain back and shone my flashlight outside. The pale circle of light danced across the grass and the cinder blocks next to my rig, empty. Yet I sensed a presence, a subtle shift in the air. Then the childlike laughter came again, so close it seemed to resonate just beneath my window. I recoiled, stifling a cry. When I peeked outside once more, nothing was there. Despite the humid night, I was cold all over. Eventually, I crept back to my bed, heart hammering. I half expected the door to burst open or the windows to rattle. But the tapping didn't return. The frogs stayed silent until dawn, as if sharing in my fright. When morning arrived, I stepped outside to check for footprints, half dreading what I'd find. Sure enough, in the soft earth near my steps lay two small impressions, a left foot and a right foot, each only a few inches long. No adult tracks, no sign of an animal. I tried rationalizing. Maybe a local kid was pranking me, though it seemed improbable at this hour and in this isolated environment. I forced down a hasty breakfast and decided not to share this with Ray or Naomi. They'd either think I was hysterical, or Ray might tease me about the ghost child stories. Instead, I packed my gear for the evening outing. I spent the day in a dull haze of anxiety, wandering shorter trails to distract my mind. At one point, I thought I caught a glimpse of a small figure darting behind a cypress trunk, but it vanished when I rounded the bend. By 6 p.m., I stood at the boat launch, sweat trickling down my spine. Ray was there, loading a cooler and tackle box into the aluminum boat. He wore a threadbare flannel shirt and a wide-brimmed hat. Clouds bunched overhead, threatening a storm. I swallowed hard, giving him a tight smile. "Ready?" he asked, eyeing my camera bag. I nodded, stepping gingerly into the unsteady boat. A minute later, we chugged away from the launch, the outboard motor sputtering. The water reflected the gray sky, and Spanish moss drooped like ancient curtains. Every so often, the water parted with a swirl, probably an alligator submerging at our approach. Ray seemed relaxed as he guided us into winding channels lined by cypress knees. I sat at the bow, scanning for birds or gators to photograph. My camera was loaded, but my mind was a whirl of nervous energy, anticipating that laugh or a small silhouette at the water's edge. As dusk set in, Ray cut the motor. "I usually drift from here," he said. "Less noise to spook the fish." We floated slowly, the boat rocking. A few fish jumped, splashing the otherwise still surface. I snapped pictures of the water at golden hour, capturing the reflection of clouds tinted with orange and pink. In that moment, it felt almost peaceful. I tried to let the swamp's natural splendor calm me, but every so often I'd hear a faint rustle that set my teeth on edge. Night fell swiftly, and Ray clicked on a lantern. Moths fluttered in the glow, and our boat bobbed in gentle ripples. I turned my camera to the tree line, adjusting the ISO for low-light shots. That's when I thought I saw it again, a small figure standing among the cypress knees. The child, pale, motionless, as if waiting. I inhaled sharply and snapped a shot. The flash illuminated the trees for a split second, and I saw nothing there. Or maybe the figure was gone. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Ray glanced over, but I didn't say a word. He resumed fiddling with his fishing gear. Moments later, a breeze drifted across the water, carrying a muffled sound. Laughter, far away but undeniably childlike. Ray froze, looking up. His eyes locked on mine. "Hear that?" he said, voice tense. I nodded, throat tight. He gave a nervous chuckle, as if trying to brush it off, but I saw his hands shake slightly on the fishing rod. "Could be, I don't know, coyotes? A bird?" We both knew it wasn't a bird. The laughter came again, this time echoing from multiple directions, as if the swamp itself teased us. Ray cursed under his breath, reeled in his line, and started the motor. "We're going back," he said tersely. "Catfish be damned." I was too rattled to argue. The engine sputtered, then roared as we navigated the winding channels under a blackening sky. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then in heavier sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the bowed shapes of the cypress. I swallowed a rising panic. The child's laughter seemed to chase us, weaving through the patter of rain. Finally, we reached the boat launch. We hauled ourselves and our gear onto the dock, each soaked through and shivering despite the warmth of the air. Ray turned to me. "You best get to your RV," he said, a slight quiver in his voice. "I'll see you around." I didn't argue, sprinting back to my site. The rain hammered the roof as I climbed inside and locked the door. My heart wouldn't slow down. I slung off my wet clothes and toweled my hair. Then I rummaged for my camera to check the images I'd taken. Maybe I'd captured the figure. That would at least prove I wasn't imagining everything. I flipped through the shots. Most were dark or blurred by motion. A few captured cypress silhouettes in the flash. Then I reached the photo from the moment I'd seen the figure. My heart nearly stopped. There, in the far corner, was a faint shape. A small body, maybe 3 feet tall, the features half lost in the shadows. The eyes, though. The eyes caught the flash, reflecting twin points of eerie white. The shape looked more like a smudged doll or a half-formed wraith than a living child, but it was definitely there. Terror seized me, yet I couldn't look away. This was no ordinary prank, no optical illusion. Something was out there, something that left footprints by my RV, something that laughed at midnight, that beckoned and taunted across the water. I spent that night wide awake, lantern burning, waiting for dawn's salvation. Rain pummeled the roof and thunder boomed, as if the swamp churned with restless spirits. The laughter didn't return, but I sensed I was being watched. Around 4 a.m, the storm finally relented, and exhaustion forced me into a fitful sleep. At sunrise, I made a decision. I needed answers, or closure, or maybe just a confrontation with whatever haunted this place. That might mean venturing deeper into the swamp. I recalled the old pamphlet. There was a half-flooded trail known as Goose Creek Boardwalk, leading to a rotted shack rumored to be one of the oldest homesteads in the area. Local legend said a family once lived there before the land was absorbed into the wildlife refuge. The child who disappeared might have been from that homestead. If I could find some physical trace, an artifact, a record, it might help me understand the ghost's story. I packed water, snacks, my camera, a flashlight, a small battery pack, though it had hardly any juice left, and a printed copy of a local map. My RV battery had drained again overnight, so I had no illusions about relying on my electronics. After glancing at the pictures of the figure one last time, I steeled myself and set out. The path to Goose Creek Boardwalk was muddy, overgrown from the storm. The cypress forest grew denser as I went, twisting roots protruding at bizarre angles. I followed the compass on my phone as best as I could until the phone died altogether. Faint sunlight streamed through the canopy, but the air felt thick, stifling. 1,000 small noises, drips of water, rustling leaves, distant frogs, echoed all around me. My pulse hammered every time I mistook them for laughter. At length, I found the boardwalk. Portions of it were slippery, some half submerged in the tea-colored swamp water. Spanish moss hung in heavy clumps. In the distance stood a derelict shack, its wooden walls sagging, a collapsed roof sagging over one side. I approached slowly, every step accompanied by the creak of old planks. The shack's door was ajar, the darkness inside swallowing the morning light. A mildew stench wafted out, laced with something stale, like old decay. I stepped over the threshold. Water had pooled in corners, rotting the floor. My flashlight beam illuminated battered furniture, a table with 3 legs, a rusted stove, and a moldy mattress on the floor. Near the back, the beam caught a row of faint scratch marks on the wall, like a child's height measurements. Next to it hung a warped plank of wood, carved with letters. Die. The rest worn away by time, possibly a name. My heart panged. This place felt like a tomb left to the swamp. A sudden hush fell over the outside world again, as if the cypress and creatures were holding their breath. I froze, goosebumps prickling. Then I heard it. The laughter, soft and melodic, drifting from behind the shack. I forced my feet to move, stepping out a broken back door into a small yard ringed by bent fence posts. Muddy water sloshed around my ankles. At the edge of the yard lay a half-submerged trunk, ancient and battered. Something about it tugged at my mind. Could it hold answers? Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rumbled. Another storm was rolling in. Quickly I squatted by the trunk, trying to pry it open. Rusted hinges groaned, refusing to budge. I rummaged for a small multi-tool from my camera bag and jimmied it into the lock. My hands shook with urgency, sweat dripping down my forehead. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the ghost child, closer than ever. A pale figure standing maybe 10 feet away, half in the water, wearing what looked like tattered old-fashioned clothes. The face was indistinct, a swirl of pallid features that almost resolved into eyes, mouth, nose, but not quite. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, multi-tool in hand. The child raised one hand, as if beckoning me. I stifled a gasp. Was it asking for help, or luring me deeper? My knees felt weak, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. For an instant I pitied it. A lost soul, trapped in these watery woods. Maybe it needed something to set it free. Summoning courage, I forced the trunk open with a final wrench. The lid splintered, and inside lay a cluster of rotted cloth, a small teddy bear missing one eye, and a thin-bound booklet, perhaps a diary or a child's notebook. The bear's glass eye glinted at me. A wave of sadness gripped my throat, imagining a scared kid alone in the swamp. Thunder boomed again and the child's figure flickered like static. Then it advanced a single step, water rippling around its ankles. I lifted the teddy bear, feeling the sodden, decaying fabric. "Is this yours?" I whispered, voice trembling. Another step from the apparition. It bowed its head in what looked like longing. My chest tightened. I'd never believed in ghosts before, not truly, but seeing this I felt a desperate need to help. Perhaps I could give the bear a proper burial on higher ground, or see if the notebook offered clues to the child's name. Maybe that might release the spirit. The moment I had that thought, the child vanished, dissolving into the humid air like a swirl of fog. The hush broke, and the swamp's noise returned in a roar. Buzzing insects, dripping water, the rising wind of the storm. Lightning cracked overhead, sending me into motion. I stuffed the teddy bear into my camera bag, tucking the notebook in beside it, and sloshed my way back into the shack. It was time to leave, but as I turned, water began flooding faster around the shack's foundation. The storm was hitting hard, raising the swamp water quickly. I scrambled back onto the boardwalk, but half of it was already submerged. I ended up wading waist-deep through muddy water, pushing fallen branches aside. I lost my footing more than once. The thunder raged overhead, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. My arms and legs trembled with exertion and raw fear. At last, I reached more solid ground, panting, drenched. I stumbled over roots and found the path that had led me here. The downpour battered the canopy. I pressed on for what felt like hours, ignoring cuts and bruises, adrenaline my only fuel. Eventually the land rose slightly, and I glimpsed the edges of the campground. Relief flooded me. I half ran, half limped into my sight, fumbling for the RV keys. Inside, I stripped off my soaked clothes. My body shook from the cold and shock. My watch said it was late afternoon. though it felt like I'd been gone a lifetime. I gently set the teddy bear on my table and opened the waterlogged notebook. Most pages were unreadable, the ink blurred. But on a few, I could make out scribbles, childlike drawings of cypress trees, a small house, and swirling shapes of water. One page had a shaky signature at the bottom. Sandy. That matched the partial carving on the shack wall. So the child's name was Sandy, I breathed out, feeling a rush of sorrow for this lost soul. It dawned on me that the spirit might not be malicious, merely stuck in a loop, searching for someone or something that never came. The footprints, the laughter, the tapping, it could have been trying to reach out, not harm me. Dusk crept in as I sat there, uncertain. I had Sandy's bear and notebook. Should I keep them, return them to the shack, or bury them somewhere safe? Another option, maybe the local authorities had records. If I gave Naomi the notebook, perhaps she could arrange a small memorial. My mind teemed with possibilities. I just knew I didn't want to exploit the ghost for my blog or my photos, no matter how sensational it might be. A gentle knock at my door made me jump. Heart pounding, I peered through the window. To my relief, it was Naomi in her ranger uniform, water dripping from her poncho. I let her in, trying to calm my breathing. "You were gone all day," she said, concern evident. "Ray mentioned you were talking about exploring deeper trails. I got worried with this storm." I gestured for her to sit, ignoring the soaked seat cushions. Without thinking too much, I pulled out the teddy bear and the notebook, explaining in a shaky voice what I'd found. I confessed the sightings, the footprints, the laughter. Part of me expected her to call me crazy, but she listened gravely. When I finished, Naomi let out a slow breath. "Sandy, huh? We do have records of a family that lived in a homestead out there. They had a child, Sandra, who vanished around 1947 during a bad storm. The father insisted she'd drowned, but no body was ever recovered. Local legends ran wild after that." My hands trembled as I clutched the bear. "I think she's still there, in a sense." I felt like she wanted help. Naomi reached out gently, her eyes softening. "Maybe you already helped," she said. "You remembered her, found her things, and you're not just walking away. That alone might mean something." We talked about potential ways to honor the child's memory. A small ceremony, burying the teddy bear near the old shack or in a drier spot, placing a simple marker. Naomi offered to help, but I'd had all the haunting I could handle for a lifetime. She respected that. "I'll organize something with a few of the locals," she said. "We can mark the site properly. If that's enough to give Sandy peace, let's hope so." She left soon after, leaving me with a jumble of emotion, relief, sorrow, and lingering unease. That night, for the first time, I slept without hearing laughter or tapping at my door. The next morning, the sky dawned clear and bright, the swamp glistening as if washed anew. My solar batteries even managed to hold a decent charge, as though the oppressive weight on this place had lifted. I spent one more day photographing the Okefenokee, capturing some final, stunning shots of the cypress in the fresh sunlight. Then I hit the road, telling Naomi I planned to send her a handful of the photos I took, and the battered teddy bear too, so she could add it to the small memorial they intended to place near the shack. She agreed, promising to handle it with care. As I steered my RV onto the highway, I glanced at the reflection of the swamp in my side mirror. A pang went through me. I thought of that pale figure beckoning from the water's edge, the sorrow in those half-formed eyes. I hoped Sandy would find rest, that the final trace of her heartbreak might fade from those haunted cypress groves. To this day, I don't relish telling people what happened in the Okefenokee. It's not exactly a feel-good campfire tale, but I've learned that some places hold stories older and deeper than we realize. Sometimes these stories refuse to die until they're remembered and resolved. Sandy's story was one of them, a child lost to the swamp, wandering in lonely midnight laughter. Part of me still hears that echo on quiet nights, reminding me there's far more to this world than what we can see or photograph. And sometimes, the only way to bring peace to a ghost is to recognize its humanity, even if it's decades too late. I left those cypress trees behind, but a piece of me stayed there, with Sandy's teddy bear and diary pages swirling in the marshy wind. Maybe that's the cost of stepping into the world of lost spirits. Once you see them, you can never forget. And maybe, in remembering, you grant them the one thing they've needed all along, a witness to their story.